Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial on Poppies, a poem from the AQA Poetry Anthology, and this is a poem by Weir. In terms of our key context, hopefully lots of us understand Armistice Sunday, we understand Poppies. Today is the 11th of November, which I've just taken my poppy off my lanyard, so it's super appropriate. And comes from, the poet Jane Weir was asked by Caroline Duffy to write about kind of suffering and grief in more modern conflicts, actually looking at families who might have lost relatives in the Afghanistan or Iraq conflicts. So yes, about war, but more modern conflict. Okay, so I'm going to move my poppy rather than just play with it in a really irritating fashion. Apologies, but it's appropriate, isn't it? Poppies are this symbol of remembrance. People wear them in this country as a marker of respect, to acknowledge the losses. And there's plenty of stuff out there about poppies and their origin. I don't need to kind of go into that now. But in this poem, which really focuses on a very personal loss, a mother's loss of her son who's gone to war, poppies as that sense of memories and remembering is really a sort of dominant theme in this poem, isn't it? The idea of her remembering experiences with her son and unable to really move past that. So the first stanza focuses on, it really sets the scene. When we talk about structure, yeah, there's techniques, repetition, questions, but structure can be, opening lines. Where does the kind of poet position us straight away? And we're told it's 3 days before Armistice Sunday, so we're in November, similar time of year to now. Now, Armistice Sunday is very much a public event. The Queen, the Prime Minister will lay poppies at the cenotaph. It's this displayed and public grief. And so that's then kind of contrasted with poppies being put on individual war graves, and it kind of reminds us that we have a public acknowledgement as a country, but if you've lost someone in war, it's very different, it's personal. Individual war graves have also had poppies placed on them. And it's not just this collective loss, it is personal. And then we get this caesura here, and we then go straight into the mother's focus, and we use this, this use of sort of direct address, as though she's talking to her son. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms, blah, blah, blah. And so there's a couple of things here, isn't there? It's very tactile maternal behaviour. Mums and dads, parents, kind of fuss over their children, school uniforms. Do they look smart? Do they look presentable? In this case, the son is going to war, but the mother still feels moved to kind of to touch it, to have that tactile contact. She, ironically is putting a poppy onto the lapel on his suit, on his jacket. And we then get some, again, military image. We talked about this with exposure, and it's also there in Storm on the Island, where we've got, spasms, it's an injurious kind of imagery, a blockade of bias binding around your blazer, and then, the sellotape bandaged around my hand. The mum is basically fussing over him, making sure he looks smart in his uniform, but even in this memory, it's overwhelmed with images of war and of the spasms, the bandage, these images of potential injury that the son has experienced. And we see this sort of maternal fussing continues into the second stanza. The sellotape bandaged around my hand. And again, this is, an example of something that's polysemic. She's literally sort of bandaged round. So if you've ever done that, I have a massive yellow Labrador, so I endlessly am putting sellotape on my hand and patting off hairs on my clothes. And she's doing that in this terms with white cat hairs. But this idea of rounding up, again, sort of reminds us a bit of conscription, about, not in modern wars, but in the past where conscription existed, soldiers forced into joining the military. And so as she does this and smooths down his shirt, we've got this image here of this metaphorical image of steeled the softening of my face. And I think that's a really important quote. As her son prepares to go to war, she tries to be brave. She steels, she makes hard her face. Her face is kind of softening, and she wants to cry, but she kind of pulls it all together. And we see she kind of then goes on longing for the childhood where she could protect him. That game where parents and children kind of smush each other's faces and rub their noses, sort of like Eskimos. And she remembers when he was little. What's interesting here is that she tries to stop herself. She resists the impulse to run her fingers through his hair. She has a desire to hug, to touch, and she's trying to stop herself. She doesn't want to kind of make a big scene, but every part of her mum instinct tells her she wants to hold him as much as she can and protect him. She's lost for words here. The words flattened, rolled and turned into felt. And this is one of a number of textile images, to do with clothes and cloth and that we have in this poem, and it sort of reminds us of stereotypical roles of women, often sort of repairing children's clothes, stitching things, making costumes and things for their children. So we get this semantic field of sewing that is throughout the poem. We'll look at it in a bit. But we see through this enjambment from turned into felt, slowly melting, that she's sort of rapidly losing control. Her son's uniformed up and ready to go off to war, but she's lost for words, but this increasing pace through the enjambment and through this asyndetic listing. Asyndetic listing is just where you have commas rather than the word and, or it could be another conjunction. But it increases the pace and it shows a lack of kind of composure and control. Now she pulls herself together and she talks about going with him to the front door and throwing it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. Now doors are often used metaphorically to emphasize freedom, they've had a door open to them. It's the sense of going through into something else. So it could be freedom equally, and perhaps more realistically in this situation, it's opportunity for danger. But we get this sense of for the son going to war, the world is overflowing like a treasure chest. That simile is quite key. It evokes a sense of adventure and opportunity. And we see this idea of this recurring image of time, a split second and he was away, intoxicated. Intoxicated we usually use in terms of someone who's drunk, but in this he's kind of drunk on perhaps the propaganda, perhaps the excitement, or perhaps the idea of adventure, of going to war. Intoxicated is not seen in terms of a positive. Perhaps she's concerned that he is naive to the reality or the danger of going to war. Now, ambiguously, in this next few lines, she says, after you'd gone, I went to your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. The after you'd gone bit, I'm not sure whether this means after he's literally just gone off to war and joined the army, or if this is about him passing away and dying. Either way, we've got this image of a mother going to her child's room and weeping, crying. I'm assuming that the son didn't keep a songbird in a cage in his bedroom. Weird, creepy if he did. But in this instance, in this metaphor, it really evokes the sense to which he's crying, perhaps releasing him, saying goodbye. And then ironically, this sort of image of peace flew from the pear tree. Very unusual line this, it's repeated the image of the dove. But pear trees are kind of symbols of long life. And yet here we have a dove flying from it. It feels to be symbolizing that his spirit has gone on, possibly to heaven, that his long life has been cut short. Doves we associate with peace. Maybe he's now at peace. So I think there's a few interpretations here, and it is ambiguous. And this is where it has led me, a bit like with exposure where it says tonight. We're brought back to a kind of present point here, and the poet positions the mum as skirting the churchyard walls, stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats. Again, more asyndetic listing. We get this field of sewing, and we think about, stereotypically, I'm not necessarily talking about modern family dynamics, but, mums would, part of their caring process, cooking meals and revolving around caring for children, making clothes and things. She doesn't have that to do. Her son is gone. And so these making tucks and darts, they don't refer to making clothes anymore. It's more her stomach is kind of, she feels sick. It's, you know, she's got butterflies in her stomach. And we get this sense of without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf gloves. I find this interesting in two ways. Firstly, it reminds us of how unprepared soldiers have been in war situations. Exposure would be the obvious example for this. You know, they were not prepared. They were not given the kit, the clothes that they needed. But secondly, this image of it being November and this mum out wandering around, taking herself off to the churchyard without a coat on, because she now neglects herself. Her life is dominated by her grief, and such, you know, simple things like putting on a coat in the cold weather doesn't even occur to her. So in this last stanza then, she reaches the top of the hill and traces the inscriptions on the war memorial. I think it is ambiguous, but I'm working on the assumption that his name is there and that this is a way to feel close to him. She misses the tactile nature of being able to hug and to touch her son and express love physically through holding him, and this is one way that she can perhaps feel that closeness. The leaning against it like a wishbone, I mean, images here, she's sort of weak with grief. Wishbones, I was talking to someone about this and they didn't know about wishbones, but you know, when you have a chicken and you get that bone and two people snap it and make a wish. But I don't know, maybe it's something you've not heard of either, but it might just be a Yorkshire thing. But the leaning against it like a wishbone, she's weak with grief, and I think it just evokes, she desperately is praying, hoping, wishing that her son was there. So we get this image again of the dove, this image of peace, and there's lots of religious connotations to the dove, which you can look into in more depth. But the dove pulls freely against the sky. I interpret this around it's carrying the spirit of the dead to heaven, it's taking her son. And so perhaps there's a degree of comfort that she finds in this image. An ornamental stitch. Quite often we sort of skip over this line, but ornamental stitches are, you know, they're decorative, they're there for an aesthetic, for a pleasing thing. They're not integral to the sort of structure of a garment. And so to me this sort of conveys the sense that their connection, that mother-son connection, it now is insubstantial. It's just it's a memory. It's not a physical kind of connection anymore. And then just really, really sort of sad and poignant here at the end. I listened hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. And I just think, you know, that's a parent dominated by grief, longing to turn back time, to recapture childhood, when she could keep him safe, play childhood games, where she could make clothes for him and sort out his uniform, and, you know, a time before he went off to war, and she has lost him. So a really very sort of tragic and not tragic, but just a really poignant kind of little poem. And I thought, with it being the 11th today, with it being Remembrance, Armistice Day, it felt appropriate to do a little tutorial on this. Okay, if you're going to do links to this, I think you can think about the impact on family. And so you can think about how Kamikaze fits in quite nicely with that. You can really, in an interesting way, make connections to Remains. Remains, the soldier is dominated by the memories of what he's done. Really different, but with some similar ideas. You can look at something like Bayonet Charge. Bayonet Charge deals with the soldier going over the top. This is almost the mum of that soldier, isn't it? In terms of the consequence of that. You can obviously look at something like Charge of the Light Brigade. I think that would be harder to look at, honestly. You could look at War Photographer, again, similar to Remains in terms of looking back and having memories. You could definitely link to Exposure as well. So lots of things about, you could even perhaps look at imagery in terms of memories. Again, I think these bottom three might be hardest, so I would be inclined to look at probably remains, bayonet charge and charge of the light brigade as my three biggies there. Okay, so I hope this is useful in terms of your understanding of the poem and how and where you could make some connections. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.